You're 12 years old, sitting alone in a hole in the earth so dark you can't see your own hand. Somewhere above you, 100 men are breathing air that only exists because you're doing your job right. And your only job is to listen for the sound of a mule cart, because if you fall asleep, the whole mine could explode. No pickaxe, no shovel, no motion at all most of the time. Just you, a wooden door, and the dark. By the end of this video, you'll understand what it actually meant to be a child sitting in total darkness for 10 to 12 hours a day. Why a job that looked like nothing was treated as one of the most critical positions in the entire mine. And why the silence of that job was more dangerous than any machine down there with you. You probably think child labor in a coal mine meant kids swinging pickaxes. Hard work, brutal work, but at least active work. At least something to do with your hands and your hours. The trapper boy's job proves that assumption wrong in the worst possible way. Here's what he actually did. A trapper boy sat at a wooden door built into a mine tunnel, and his entire task was to open it when a coal cart or mule train needed to pass, then close it again immediately after. That door controlled the mine's airflow. Simple, right? So why did mine owners treat this nothing job as essential to keeping every miner in the shaft alive? Photographer Lewis Hines spent years in the early 1900s documenting exactly these boys. Some were 14, some were younger. He photographed them stationed at their doors for entire shifts, faces caked in coal dust, eyes adjusted to darkness in a way no child's eyes should be. One of his documented subjects, a boy named Vance, 15 years old, working in West Virginia, was paid 75 cents for 10 hours, 75 cents to sit in a hole and wait. That pay rate wasn't an accident, it was a message. The mine owners priced the job as if it required nothing, because on paper, it looked like nothing. A door, a boy. Open, close, repeat. If that's really all it was, why did an entire mine's ventilation depend on him getting it exactly right, every single time, for 10 hours straight? Here's where the easy job story falls apart completely. That trapdoor wasn't decoration. It was part of the mine's ventilation system, a series of doors that directed fresh air toward the men working deep underground and pushed foul air out. Leave the door open too long or close it at the wrong moment, and you could cut off airflow to men working half a mile into the earth. They wouldn't know until they started struggling to breathe. Get the timing wrong the other way, and gas could build up in pockets behind the door. Coal mines produce methane constantly, and methane doesn't need a spark from a machine to ignite. An entire section of tunnel could go up in an instant, and the boy sitting at the door would likely be the first one it reached. And there was a third danger, one that had nothing to do with air or gas at all. Mule carts hauling coal moved fast in cramped tunnels, and they were hard to stop. If the trapper boy didn't open the door in time, or opened it a half second too late, the cart could derail, jackknife, or simply run him down where he sat. So the boy wasn't doing nothing. He was holding responsibility for other men's oxygen, for a possible explosion, and for his own body, all at once, for hours. What was it actually like to sit there and wait for any one of those three things to happen? It was quiet. That's the detail almost nobody expects. Mine owners often kept trapper boys working in near or total darkness, because candles and lamp oil cost money, and a boy sitting still didn't need to see anything until a cart approached. So he sat there, in the black, for the stretch of time between one cart and the next, which could be minutes or could be much longer. The BBC dramatization The Trapper reconstructs this world through a 12-year-old named Jimmy Turton, working in 1840s Northeast England, and it draws directly from oral histories and mine records, describing exactly this kind of isolation. No conversation, no light, just the sound of water dripping somewhere in the tunnel, the occasional creak of timber overhead, and his own breathing, hour after hour. There was no clock down there, no way to check how much of the shift was left. Time didn't move in minutes for a trapper boy. It moved in the gaps between carts, and those gaps could stretch long enough that a tired child's mind would start playing tricks in the dark. What does that kind of sensory deprivation do to a child? Not for one shift, but for weeks, months, years of repetition. Nobody wrote that answer down at the time, because nobody was asking the question. But the physical toll is documented clearly enough. Trapper boys worked 6 days a week, entering the mine before sunrise and climbing back out after sunset. In winter months, some of these boys went days at a stretch without seeing daylight at all, entering in darkness and leaving in darkness, with only the mine's darkness in between. Beyond the trapping job itself, boys working in mines more broadly suffered crushed limbs, lost fingers, and fatal accidents that appear again and again in child labor records from this era, not as isolated tragedies, but as a documented, recurring pattern. And the psychological cost of prolonged isolation and darkness at a developmental age was never studied at the time, because there was no framework yet for even asking whether a child's mind could be damaged by silence and dark alone. This wasn't a rare, exploitative outlier job either. It was standard across coal regions in Britain and the United States both. So how did an entire industry decide this was simply fine for a child to endure? Coal ran everything. Steel mills, railroads, factories, home heating. The entire machinery of the industrial age burned coal to function, and that demand never slowed down. Mine owners needed labor that was cheap and plentiful enough to keep pace with it, and children solved a problem adult workers physically couldn't. Boys were small. Tunnels, especially older or narrower shafts, were often too low for a grown man to work comfortably, but a child could fit through them without trouble. And boys were cheap, paid a fraction of what an adult miner earned, for work the owners had already convinced themselves required nothing at all. In the United States, the minimum legal age for underground coal mine work wasn't raised to 18 until 1938. Say that number again. 1938. That's not medieval history. That's within living memory of people's great-grandparents, inside a country that already had cars, radio, and skyscrapers. So what actually changed? And why did it take that long to change something this obviously dangerous for a child? Change didn't come from one law or one dramatic moment. It came slowly, and it came from evidence. Photographers like Lewis Hine didn't just happen to photograph these children. He sought them out deliberately, spending years documenting them specifically to build public pressure against an industry that had no incentive to reform itself. His photographs were activism, built to make the public see what mine owners had kept literally underground and out of sight. Alongside that, labor reform movements pushed for compulsory education laws, arguing that a child's place was in a classroom, not a mine shaft. And mounting public evidence of injury and death made the old arguments harder to defend. There was no single bill that ended this overnight. It eroded, case by case, photograph by photograph, over decades. And here's the detail that should sit uncomfortably with you. Even after reform pressure mounted, the job of trapper boy didn't disappear because someone decided children deserved better. It vanished largely because mine ventilation technology improved, replacing human-operated doors with mechanical systems that didn't need a child sitting in the dark at all. The children weren't rescued so much as made obsolete. If that unsettles you, the next thing worth understanding is what happened to the children who worked above ground instead of below it, because the breaker boys sorting coal by hand tell an equally documented, equally brutal story, and it's coming up on this channel next. So the door that trapped boys in darkness for the better part of a century didn't close because society decided a 12-year-old belonged somewhere safer. It closed because the machines got better first. What does it say about an entire economic system that the comfort of the workforce mattered less than the efficiency of the equipment replacing them? Somewhere right now, a version of you at 12 years old is being asked to sit still, be quiet, and not complain, just at an unrecognizably smaller scale and with none of the danger. It's worth remembering that the trapper boy's job wasn't dangerous because it was physically hard. It was dangerous because he was invisible. Nobody was stationed nearby to check if he was afraid. Nobody was watching to see if he was okay. Every labor protection you've never had to think twice about, child labor laws, safety regulations, the basic cultural assumption that a 12-year-old belongs in a classroom and not a mine shaft, exists today because someone first had to go underground, and document a child's suffering, photograph by photograph, testimony by testimony, before anyone in power was willing to act. You've probably never had to sit alone in the dark, holding responsibility for a disaster you couldn't even see coming toward you. But somewhere in your family's history, a kid your age or younger did exactly that every single day, and it was considered so unremarkable it barely made the wage worth recording. The safety you take for granted now, the assumption that childhood should be protected rather than spent underground, wasn't handed down out of kindness. It was built, slowly, on the backs of boys that nobody thought to ask if they were afraid. This wasn't fiction. This was somebody's whole life. Cursed roles.